Hi, I'm Guy Podjarny. I'm the founder of Sneak. Open source is neither more or less secure than private code, but what it is far more prevalent. Open source is used by pretty much every piece of software on the internet, and the majority of applications, the majority of code within them is actually open source code. And so when a vulnerability is found in an open source component, it might affect a much wider number of companies than maybe private code. Two examples come to mind. When Heartbleed was found, this was a vulnerability in OpenSSL, a popular open source library for enabling HTTPS and TLS communication. It affected roughly a third of the internet. And so now that many websites might allow you to pierce through, or might allow an attacker to pierce through the HTTPS protection and see the data. Log4Shell is a more recent example of a remote command execution vulnerability in a very popular Log4j library used by pretty much every enterprise application that has some years to it, and allowing an attacker to fairly easily run attacks within those banks and other significantly security-sensitive organizations. This wide adoption of open source makes it a far more compelling target for attackers, and so they've been focusing their energy on finding vulnerabilities in open source components and then seeking out the many victims that they might enable. To tackle open source security and make open source safer, we need to do two primary things. First is we need to help open source maintainers write secure code. Open source maintainers are great, and they are doing the world a great service by writing, oftentimes freely unpaid, code that we can all benefit from and derive value from. However, they're not necessarily equipped with knowing about security problems. And while a company might have software developers on one hand and security teams on the other, software built by open source maintainers is oftentimes built kind of on their own, just the maintainers, and they will have varied level of security expertise and definitely varied level of security tooling support. And so as a community, we need to support those maintainers. We need to help them with security resources. We need to build security tools that they can actually use and successfully secure their code. We need to level up their education, and we need to be tolerant but demanding of them to ensure that they actually write secure code, because all of our futures and all of our lives depend on it. The second thing we need to do is to get a really robust supply chain security practice going. Organizations that consume open source, they need to know which open source components are they using. It's very easy to just download some piece of open source, some library, and just use it and not track any record. There's no procurement, there's no financial exchange. Furthermore, most open source that you are consuming is actually used by the open source components that you've downloaded in the first place. You use one library, and that uses 10 other libraries, and they use 100 other libraries. And so organizations need to know which components they are using, and they need to be able to track the pedigree of these components throughout their history. Which components are here, who wrote them, which other components they might be using, have they been security tested, what was indeed the competency in terms of security of the maintainers, and so on and so forth. And to successfully track that across the supply chain, we need the whole community to participate. We need standards and tools that help us track open source, who was involved in it, what has happened to it throughout time. This is just like we do with physical supply chain standards. We have all sorts of ISO standards and others that span companies, that span countries, and help us understand what can we trust and what needs to be manually vetted. And we need that type of supply chain security practices applied to software. We need software supply chain security components and standards and tooling, and we need that to be adopted by the open source community as a whole and the commercial entities that consume it. This is a long journey, but there's a lot of exciting activity going there, including work being done by the Open Source Security Foundation, or OpenSSF, and we are evolving our use of open source to be more responsible, more mature, and eventually more secure.